Welcome back to Jail Psychologist. This week I'm going to give you a brief introduction to something called Assisted Outpatient Treatment, or AOT, otherwise known as an outpatient civil commitment. I'll explain the basic concept as well as why it's gaining momentum and talk about the problems that it does and does not solve. If you're interested in doing a deep dive on AOT, I'll put a link to the Treatment Advocacy Center in the description. They're the de facto experts on AOT, and you'll find a ton of resources on their website. So, what is AOT and why do we need it? Well, for those of you who don't work in the mental health field, you may or may not be aware that there's a giant gap in the treatment continuum between outpatient care and the state psychiatric hospital. Outpatient care is for people who have a mental health problem or two, but they're generally able to function on a day-to-day basis. State psychiatric hospitals, at least on paper, are supposed to house and treat the sickest people in society who need the most intensive services. Now, in reality, they don't always function like that, but we'll save that rabbit hole for another day. Now, what if a patient's mental health symptoms are too severe for outpatient care, but aren't quite severe enough to require a long-term stay at a state hospital? Well, before AOT came along, the only real option was short-term emergency care at a community behavioral health hospital. Now, what a lot of people don't understand about these community psychiatric hospitals is that they are not set up to provide long-term care. In the movies, you see people going into an inpatient psych hospital and they come out 2 months later. This is not at all how it works in reality. Most psych hospitals keep patients from 3 to 7 days. And that's fine if you're someone who is normally stable and you're just experiencing a temporary psychiatric emergency. However, it's not fine if you're someone with a chronic and serious mental illness who is not willing to participate in treatment. About 50% of patients with a psychotic disorder lack an awareness of their disorder. We call this anosognosia. So these chronically ill patients will not voluntarily take medication, which causes them to be too unstable for outpatient care. They're often hospitalized at these community psychiatric hospitals involuntarily via an emergency detention order or whatever your state calls an emergency commitment. And since these hospitals don't hold people for more than a week, what you end up seeing is this merry-go-round between the community where the patient is often homeless, local psychiatric hospitals, and jails. So where does AOT come in? Assisted outpatient treatment interrupts this cycle by leveraging the legal system for help. In brief, AOT involves therapy, medication management, and case management services, all wrapped around the patient and backed up by the force of the court. The judge basically says, John, you can either take your medication and participate in therapy, or I'm going to order you to be detained and sent to a state psychiatric hospital. Now, it does feel slightly awkward to coerce someone into treatment, but look at it this way. In most states, the petitioner has to show that the patient has a serious mental illness and a history of deterioration or dangerousness without treatment. If I can prove that, then it follows that allowing the patient to refuse treatment is not a morally serious thing to do. And if you're a person who's unmoved by moral arguments, then consider the fiscal cost of allowing such a person to refuse treatment. It costs over $100 a day to keep someone in my jail. It costs $2,000 a day to keep someone in a state psychiatric hospital. And you can't put a price on the harm that the patient or other members of the community might suffer due to a lack of treatment. Alright, so you want to do AOT. 47 U.S. states have outpatient civil commitment statutes. You'll have to check your state's statute for specifics, but I'll walk you through my county's AOT process quickly so you have a general idea of how it works. Once again, if you really want to know about AOT in detail, check out the Treatment Advocacy Center's website. So, in my county, you can get into AOT in one of two ways. You can get referred from the community, or you can get referred from the jail. From the community, a therapist or prescriber sends a referral to the AOT liaison at our community mental health center. They review the case to see 1. Is there a serious mental illness? 2. Is the patient dangerous or disabled without treatment? And 3. Does the patient have a history of refusing to participate in treatment? If the answer to all 3 questions is yes, then the patient might be a good candidate. The other factors worth considering are, does the patient have friends or family who are willing to be involved with care? Does the patient have transportation to and from appointments? And does the patient have a place to live? None of these things are deal breakers per se, but the treatment team will need to plan around the patient's individual situation. If everything looks good, the AOT liaison contacts their psychiatrist to discuss the case. In my state, an MD has to sign off on the civil commitment petition. So once the MD signs off, the AOT liaison gets the petition to their attorney, who files the petition with the civil court. Okay, now for the jail side. In the jail, anyone can send me an email with the patient's name and an explanation about why they think AOT is appropriate. I make referrals myself, I get referrals from our therapists, I also get referrals from judges and attorneys. I review each case from a clinical and legal perspective to make sure the case seems appropriate. Most of what I'm doing here is the same thing that the AOT liaison in the community is doing. The only difference that I need to look at is the legal situation as well. I'm trying to get someone out of the jail in order to participate in AOT, so I need to make sure that the AOT team can convince a judge to go along with the plan. The judge isn't going to let someone out of jail if they're charged with murder or terrorism or something really serious. What I'm looking for is the low-hanging fruit, so mostly misdemeanors and the lowest level felonies. When I find a patient who seems appropriate, I send emails to a liaison for the prosecutor's office and to our local community mental health center. I need both of these parties to also review the case and agree that the patient is appropriate. If they do, then I complete the civil commitment petition and have our jail medical director sign as the MD. For whatever reason, in my state, an MD has to sign the petition, even though clinical psychologists are fully trained to evaluate civil commitment criteria. I then submit my petition to the local community mental health center, who files it with the court. Notice how many systems have to coordinate for this to work. From this point on, things are mostly the same regardless of whether the referral came from the jail or the community. The court schedules a hearing. The petitioner and the patient are summoned to court, and each side provides testimony about whether they do or do not think an outpatient civil commitment is warranted. Now, I've testified in about a dozen civil commitment hearings, and in my experience, the patient is cooperative and on board with the AOT program most of the time, but this process can sometimes be adversarial. Anyway, the court will decide whether or not civil commitment is appropriate. Every petition I've filed has been approved, and I don't say this as a flex, but to emphasize that if you do your homework and provide evidence for why the commitment is necessary, it'll usually be approved. Once the commitment is approved, treatment starts immediately. My local community mental health center sends a case manager to the court hearing, so immediately after court adjourns, the case manager can introduce himself to the patient and start the treatment planning process. The patient might even start treatment or get moved to a group home that same day. How smoothly all of this goes is highly dependent on the quality of the communication between all of the parties involved. Now, one last thing worth mentioning for AOT patients who are referred from the jail. What we're seeking when we do AOT from inside the jail is a dismissal in the criminal case. This is called dismissal upon commitment to AOT. Someone from your AOT team is going to have to liaise with whatever judge is keeping the patient in jail to make sure they're willing to dismiss the case. If you don't do this, then you end up in a weird situation in which the civil court is trying to get the inmate out of jail and into treatment, and the criminal court keeps them in jail because they're not on board with the plan. So once the commitment is complete, the court will order review hearings, usually once a month, but really it's at the judge's discretion. It could be weekly, it could be once every 3 months. They'll check in with both the patient and the treatment provider to see how everything's going. In the event that the patient has not been participating in treatment, depending on your state, the judge may be able to order medication as part of the AOT plan, or the patient may need to be temporarily hospitalized for involuntary medication. Finally, the last thing the judge can do if the patient refuses to participate in treatment is to order a regular commitment to a state psychiatric hospital. This is really a last resort because it sort of defeats the purpose of doing AOT. The option to do this primarily exists as a threat for the patient. The judge brings them into court and says, look, I have the authority to send you to a state psychiatric hospital if you don't participate. And given the option to remain in the community for treatment or to be forced into a hospital to get treatment involuntarily, most patients opt for the former. So that's AOT in a nutshell. AOT isn't about controlling people. It's about preventing the cycle of jail, hospital, street, repeat. It's not going to work for every patient, but for those it does, it helps patients live stable lives in the community, and it saves money for state and local governments. If you have any questions about AOT or starting a program in your community, feel free to contact me and I'll help you get it sorted out. That's all the time we have for our session today. I'll see you next week.